Well, hello to everybody. Hi, that's about the extent of my Norwegian. So thank you very much for being willing to listen to me in English. I must say it's my Scottish English, so if I'm speaking too fast for anybody, wave or something, and I'll try and slow down. The same for our fantastic signers here, if I'm going too fast for you. So I'm really happy to be here and happy to talk about this question about how environmental and social sustainability go together. Eurodiaconia is a network of 59 organisations founded in the Christian faith, fighting poverty and promoting social justice. And our members come from 33 countries across Europe, so we're not just a European Union organisation, and represent over 30,000 social and healthcare service providers, around about 1.5 million people employed in Diaconia, and a higher number of volunteers. And we are based in Brussels, and quite often we hear this statement said quite often that Europe must go green. And these are great words. And it's part of the dream, if you like, of how we should live on the European continent. That the dream of the European continent is to be peaceful, to be inclusive, and to be responsible for people and planet. Now, right at this moment, I don't believe that the continent of Europe is any of these things. But I only have 15 minutes. So today, I'm going to focus on what it means to be responsible for people and planet in practice, and is there space for diaconia to be part of the realization of that dream. So we're trying to explore that question. How can we have a green and socially inclusive society? And how can diaconia bring it about? But to be fair, the bringing together of social policies and environmental policies is actually quite a new phenomenon in Europe. Whereas there's been a lot of work, particularly in diaconal organisations, to look at issues relating to addressing individual circumstances, such as people who find it hard to pay their energy bills, or people who find it hard to get access to quality food. There hasn't really been a lot of work at how to live in a way that is both socially and environmentally responsible, and what that means not only for individuals, but how we provide structured services like elderly care, or rehabilitation services. So that indeed is one of our challenges, is moving to that new way of thinking. And when we have asked our members in Eurodiaconia, of which Diakoniens is one, in recent years there hasn't really been a lot of response. It is still quite a new question. Of course, there are some fantastic projects like the garden, Diaconia Garden, here in Oslo, and a similar project in Stockholm. There are commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals and strong work looking at issues around food waste and recycling. But can I honestly say, this is quite a Nordic phenomenon. You're ahead. You might not think you're far enough ahead, but you are ahead. It's only really now that we start to see other diaconal organisations looking at how to align the two, environment and social. And I should say, I am focusing on Europe. The issue of climate change and social inclusion and rights has actually been a major part of the work of our ecumenical diaconia colleagues in recent years. The impact of climate change has been seen as its most damaging in the global south. And it's fair to say that the global south is a place where we have a lot to learn from about how to bring social, people's rights and environment together. But in Europe, our diaconia is structured in slightly different ways. And a lot of our diaconia is within institutionalized forms. And whereas there is a rise in community-based diaconia, and indeed the ongoing locally based work that you as deacons are doing, the major providers of social and healthcare across Europe are often from Diaconia, or indeed from our partners in Caritas. And so with that comes a responsibility to think about our spiritual basis, to think about our right spaces and think about how do we make these institutions, these structured services, and whatever we would look at them, our churches, more socially and environmentally aligned. And I'll give you some examples of that. In a lot of countries, home care services are provided by the Diaconia, and they all run cars. Yeah? And actually, some countries are very proud about the number of cars they have in providing their home care services. But we also have these amazing buildings. Again, we've built buildings to provide elderly care services, for example, but at a time when we were not considering environmental policies. So now there's a need to go back and look at these buildings and say, how do we make these align with a better footprint, environmental footprint in our societies? And then we also have to think about the materials we use, and I'll come on to this. But how many uniforms does diaconal organizations provide every year? Are they ethically made? Are they made from sustainable fabrics? So in my remaining time, I wanted to quickly look at 5 points that I think we have to consider in our diaconal work. And perhaps the first one is the most obvious. We have to see environmental sustainability as part of diaconal service delivery. Here today we're talking about green diaconia, and we need to do that to emphasize the role of environment in that whole concept of diaconia. But I hope that one day we'll just talk about diaconia, and that the sustainability, the environmental needs and the social needs will be naturally together. We fulfill our mission in diaconia by serving the most marginalized populations. And it's those most marginalized populations who are often hit the hardest by climate change, by energy issues. The impact of increased temperatures on older people who often live in inadequate housing. Flooding in Eastern Europe, where community infrastructure is damaged, there's no places to gather, as well as people losing their personal property. So we have to think of those two together and look to have a change in our thinking of diaconia that brings those two together. Because it will also enable us to uphold our creation narrative, that we're in partnership with the rest of God's creation, not in dominance or in exploitation. God created everything in balance, and that balance has been interrupted by humans not respecting the balance and finding ways to use the rest of creation for our own ends without considering the consequences. By not integrating environmental concerns with social concerns, we could be increasing vulnerability and exclusion. So we have to work hard in our diaconal work to go back to that creation narrative of balance. We often don't speak about creation when we talk about diaconia, but now we must. But the second point is that we might think that, but there are a lot of challenges to put it into action. And there are major challenges in working for a balance of these policies and these actions across Europe. And let me give you one example. Some of you have heard it before. In the Czech Republic, one of our members works in an area which is very much still dominated by coal and steel production, the so-called dirty industries. They are major sources of employment in that area. What jobs will be provided to people who will no longer work in those industries, who have been working as manual labourers in steel production their entire life? What about the secondary economy in that area, the shops and businesses who rely on the workers coming and buying from them? We can say we want to close these plants down and be cleaner in our energy, in our production of metals. But we've not come up with what's going to happen to the people who are working there. So we do need to work on having both answers, the environmental answer and the social answer. It's not good enough to tell people that their jobs will be gone. We've got to come with the alternatives that are realistic for them. And that's where there is tension. That's where we see sometimes trade unions may be fighting back against some of the environmental movement because they're saying, well, you're not telling us how people will make a living, how people will be employed. I can give you a very practical political example of this. In Germany, there was a big crisis in the government because the German government wanted everybody to work on installing heat pumps in their homes. But the heat pumps were quite expensive to install. And people revolted because there was no assistance from the government to do it. And what happened? The far-right party, the AfD, jumped on this and said, we're listening to you, the people who can't afford the heat pumps. You see what this environmental narrative is doing to you. The government had to withdraw the proposal on heat pumps. The far-right increased their share of the vote to 21%. This question is political in Europe, and we have to be advocates as to why it is the right way forward. We have to use our voices. We have to not just speak in our churches. I think there was a discussion in the previous panel about blind spots. Does the church have a blind spot? Everyone has a blind spot on this. But we can go back to our spiritual basis, our creation narrative, the concept that God created everything in balance, and use that as a form of advocacy. But we need some more things as well. My third point and my fourth point go together. It's about investment and financing. We are lacking money to make the changes that we need to make. We're lacking the partnerships with public authorities to look at things like public transport and how it can better serve communities that at the moment feel isolated. Another example from Germany as well, actually. In Germany, the financing of the care system is based on receipts. So the care centres are funded by the government, but on the basis of what they've spent. So they get their energy bill refunded, for example. But they want to change to a better energy system. But there's no money for investment, only for costs. So they have to continue with this outdated, bad for the environment energy system because the government won't pay for the changes. Or they have to try and fundraise them themselves, which is hard. So we've got to work at changing some of the ways funding is provided for diaconal work so that we can make the environmental changes that we want to. In Germany, they've also launched a big project about textiles. And textiles is a big area in Diaconia. I mean, we have a hospital here as well. In Germany, Caritas and Diaconia have come together and realized that outside of the public sector, they are the biggest purchaser of textiles in Germany. They're massive. They're absolutely massive in Germany. But that's meant that they have leverage in the market to say, no, we're only buying ethically sourced, sustainable materials for our sheets, for our nurses' uniforms, for everything. And that makes an impact. There's also hope. Maybe this is where I conclude, because it can sound quite depressing. We've got all these challenges. But there is hope for the future, because there is action happening in Diaconia, and I know that in the previous panel, you also had some practical examples. We can see textiles, as I mentioned, being an area where Diaconia can use its power as a large movement, as a large organisation, to try and force change. We see many of our members looking at trying to find ways to have better sources of energy. We see our larger members working on corporate sustainability reporting, not just telling people how much things cost financially, but how much things cost environmentally. Imagine if every church did that as well. Something I'm going to take back to my own church. We also have work in Finland on looking at our nature footprint. We talk a lot about our carbon footprint, but we also have to look at our nature footprint. And in Germany, the Diaconia there have gone into partnership with the National Nature Organization to look at how they can bring more bees planting around care homes and develop a sustainable wildlife or nature environment. In Stockholm, the city missions have the social enterprise called Remake that brings upcycling, recycling into the public market. Their biggest competitor, H&M. And our members are part of the debate. And that's what I ask you to do. Be part of the debate. Raise it in your local communities, in your wider towns and cities and municipalities. Challenge decision makers. Are you considering the environment when you make social policies? Are you considering social policies, social well-being, when you talk about the environment? Eurodiaconia is doing that. We have a working group looking at this, and we'll work on a policy paper. But the most important thing we can do is to remain hopeful that we can bring about change. It might be hard, and we might feel we don't have the skills, but we do, because you, as diaconal workers, as deacons, see what's happening locally. So take that hope, take that creation narrative of balance, and let diaconia be part of the discussion to ensure that we do move in an environmental and social way and see that as part of our diaconia. Thank you. Thank you.